Clydeside. Shipbuilding is the structure, the iron ribs on which it was formed. It produced the spark, the pulse, the red lead complexion, and much of the character of a place and the people whose lives depend on it.
In the House of Commons today, Mr. John Davies, Minister for Trade and Industry, announced that Upper Clyde shipbuilders were to go into liquidation.
That was June. 6 weeks later, the workers took over the shipyards. It was a whole new conscience-jarring tactic in the industrial war game in Britain, a work-in.
The world is witnessing the first of a new tactic on behalf of workers. We're not going in strike. We're not even having a sit-in strike. We are taking over the yards because we refuse to accept that faceless men or any group of men in Whitehall or anyone else can take decisions that devastate our livelihoods with impunity. They are not on.
They will have trouble getting us out of the yard. And the Prime Minister will need to come down himself and get us out. We're not leaving the shipyards, we've nowhere to go. That's your position, gentlemen. We're away for a bite to eat now, OK?
Bogside and Clydeside will be the same. The only difference being in Clydeside we'll be fighting for a principle which is worth fighting for, the right to work.
Unless you have lived here, you may not fully understand why there is such anger, such choking frustration. I think I can feel the hot taste of it. A generation back, all of my family, both sides of it, worked in shipyards, although none of them ended their working lives there. The Barton Road, Govan Road, at the other end of the river, East Hamilton Street. These are the roots of my life. Last time I was in here, they were working on the engines of a Royal Mail liner. A long time ago, I remember. People older than I am remember more passionately.
As an old man now, I'm only reminiscing and saying to myself, look at the time when I was a young boy. Look at the good money I used to earn in here. Beautiful place. Look at that crane there. Look at that one. Yeah, I can still hear the whistle going. I more or less had my time over there, in that corner there, you know. I was a riveter and one of the hard men in those days.
And they were taught that the phrase Clyde built was a synonym for superlative. But the tides of crisis washed up and down the river, and each time when they had receded, the view was never the same. You could look for signs among the remains, but it wasn't always easy to comprehend.
I don't know what it is, but there's something that I can't fathom up at the bottom of all this. What is the matter with the world? What is the matter with the government? What is it they're doing? They've taken away the industry, taken us all away, Job, and they've left us with nothing else. I don't know what's going to happen in Scotland. Dead.
A dozen years back, there were 12 shipyards on the upper reaches of the Clyde, and there were 21,000 directly employed in them. Now there are 4, and only 10,000 work in them. Govan, Scotstoun, Yarrow, and perhaps the most famous shipyard in Britain, the one in Clydebank that is better known as John Brown's.
The shipyard was Clydebank. Clydebank was the shipyard. We were so closely associated. There was scarcely a family who were not involved in the shipyard in one way or another.
A town built on shipbuilding and sewing machines, and neither of them the providers of a livelihood they once were. A town visited by royalty, but seldom for long by prosperity. A town of 50,000 people, some of them living in old tenements in the main street that were built specifically for the shipyard workers. Even in the good times. Do you remember the blue trams, now gone? The eternal noise of the riveters, now gone. And the one-class, working-class character of a sorehead Sunday, spithead Monday kind of a town. Just slightly the look of a victimised town. Both the local unemployment and the local rates amongst the highest in Britain. Even the new houses, built out of expediency, the need to get people as quickly as possible into decent homes. Not all good quality, not by any means. Clyde Bank, in some ways, the modern developing world seems to pass it by. The main roads go past it, the airliners go over it to and from Glasgow Airport, and even the new Erskine Bridge now seems like an escape route.
Clydebank, Jarrow, the town that was murdered. This town will also be murdered.
This was the talk. A shade of a wake in Connolly's bar, almost opposite John Brown's. It's been there since the end of the last century. Old mirrors, polished mahogany, tidy, well-run, distinctly a man's bar. All the blended smells of red lead and iron smoke and bleached dungarees are bottled up in Connolly's, with the vintage stories about the Depression days of the 30s.
After a year in the same suit, day in and day out, getting thread worn, patched and something, and with the suit deteriorating, you deteriorated along with it. That was the position. No, I don't think it was miserable so much as frustration and hopelessness, a feeling of hopelessness. How are we going to get out of this, you see? And all the good people, all the good doers and that, the Christian type of people and so on, they were prepared to give anything but work.
In some parts of Clydeside, the scenic backdrop to the Depression is still here. The tenement streets under the blind surveillance of the cranes on summer nights. If you ever kicked a ball or a peaver as a kid in Govan 40 years ago, you'd recognise it. So many reminders of the down in the doldrums days. Memory Lane, strangely peopled with flyweight boxers and heavyweight politicians. The bad times, the unemployed, the yard gates that closed in your face. And the supreme symbol of the Depression here, the rusting hull of the 534, the Queen Mary, in browns casting its shadow of gloom along the riverside. That was in the early 30s.
Now away with all your superstitions.
The unemployed singing. All these now forgotten songs, like this one and like John Brown's Cunarder lies a mouldering in the slips. McLean's Brigade, Maxton's Brigade, the streams of the Clyde marching. Work on the Queen Mary had been halted in December 1931. The money expired. Nearly 3 years later, the good news came that, thanks to financial help from the government, it would be restarted. And once again, the hammers were swung and the rivets were slung on the biggest industrial assembly job in the world. Ah, the grand, though somewhat damp, ceremonial of that royal launching with all its panoply.
Who named this ship the Queen Mary. I wish success to her and to all who stayed in her.
And that maiden voyage 18 months later, the sparkle, the extravagance of it.
And so the first passengers went on board to make up the full complement of over 3,000 souls, passengers, officers and crew. The day has arrived and the Queen Mary is leaving, bound for New York and the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. Good luck, the Queen Mary.
One newspaper correspondent aboard reported, "The passenger list is like a gossip writer's dream of heaven. I never imagined there could be so much happiness among 3,000 people all at once."
Played to you by the BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye, and here's to the next time.
After the completion of the liner, hundreds of workers who, as usual, were laid off, must have wondered when that next time was going to be. They were looking for another job. But the sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, came later, and after that they were all the wartime launchings and the post-war effort, the supermac days of the 50s, when even the shipbuilding industry had never had it so good. Well, on and off. Just after the war, Britain was producing half the world's ships, Now it is only about 5%. Other nations surpassed us. Japan, with its huge investment by giant corporations in building docks, shipbuilding machinery, and creation of skilled manpower, now puts more than half the world to sea. West Germany and Sweden too superseded us. Hard-hat traditionalism in management, over-rigid craft restrictionism in the unions. There were so many kinks in the British system that had to be straightened out sensibly. And in 1965, one attempt was initiated. Fairfields, now the Govan Yard of UCS, went bankrupt. The Labour government encouraged a businessman, Sir Ian Stewart, to try out his ideas for a new approach. They called it the Fairfield Experiment. Enthusiastically pushing this mixed socialist-capitalist package deal, the Minister for Economic Affairs, Mr. George Brown.
On the particular issue of Fairfields, which we discussed as part of the general discussion, I am, of course, very pleased that the union have found themselves able to come forward so willingly and so fully.
Only a few of the unions who were invited actually took shares. The government backed Fairfields with money. Private business, even Tory businessmen, did too. The new regime came in, the professional managers from outside with their production targets and critical path analysis and so on. As well as new production methods, they introduced a new apparatus of consultation with the shop stewards and workers. They certainly created a new spirit, but in terms of orders and output, they made some mistakes. 2 years after its inception, the Fairfields experiment was prematurely curtailed. Today, Sir Ian Stewart maintains that within its brief and within its time span, it was moving into success.
We set up the Fairfields experiment as a national proving ground, an experimental laboratory for industrial relations. And these were the words used by George Brown in the House of Commons. Basically, what I was anxious to do was to project the need for a national system of employment to handle the problem of the redundant worker, because industries, shipbuilding in particular, needed to pay off people in order to become more efficient. So the first thing we did with Fairfields was pay off a third of the labour force and then concentrate on getting more work out of what was left.
But in the Fairfield experiment, you didn't really make money.
How could we? We had 2 years out of 5. But our forecasting indicated that in '68 we would make 300,000.
The Fairfield experiment was curtailed because the yard was incorporated into something bigger, Upper Clyde Shipbuilders. With the recommendation of the Geddes report, the Labour government helped to bring together this consortium, which it was hoped would get the benefits of economies of scale and more flexible use of manpower. The man who was appointed chairman was Anthony Hepper, not a shipbuilder, but with a reputation for trying to put new life into sluggish companies. In spite of the government's finance and its felicitations, UCS started with insufficient capital to push ahead with necessary modernisation. The first thing it built up was a Leviathan loss on most of the fixed-price contracts inherited from the former companies. On top of that, it initially took on unprofitable orders of its own. With some trade union cussedness and wage inflation thrown in, the directors turned to the government and the Shipbuilding Industry Board for cash to shore up their morale-sagging enterprise. And when, in 1969, the Shipbuilding Industry Board recommended no more, Mr. Anthony Wedgwood Benn, the government minister responsible for shipbuilding since the beginning, conceded UCS another $7 million. Even on Clydeside, there were some critics who said that if Mr. Benn had ensured that it was on a sound financial footing at the start, it would not be in such an uneven keel now. Annual losses were beginning to come down, but the performance hadn't been improving fast enough. In 1969, a new man, a shipbuilder, was brought in as managing director. He was Ken Douglas, who had done a notable job in rescuing and reorganising the northeast shipyard of Austin Pickersgill. On Clydeside, he walked into an even bigger task.
What I found was that the corporate plan which had been drawn up was more or less on the same types of tonnage as the Clyde had been building for years. And in fact, the kind of mixed tonnage which had brought about the situation, not being built economically and profitably, building dredges, building oil rigs, building passenger ships, ferries and so on. And I decided, and the board agreed, that the correct thing to go for at that time was to drop all the sophistication and clear out the loss-making contracts, which were very heavy, as quickly as possible, and go for standard tonnage.
Last year, there was a change in government and a change of attitude. UCS, now minus Yarrows, who had opted out, ran into cash problems during the winter and spring. In June, they asked the government for an immediate injection of £5 to £6 million. They had already received more than 20 million. The government's answer, announced in the House of Commons, was no. UCS, with £32 million in liabilities, had no alternative but to stop trading. Right away, a provisional liquidator was appointed to wind up their affairs, pending a report by 4 government advisers. It meant the possibility of thousands of men out of work, in an unhopeful year, in an unhopeful place. There was a feeling that clenched like a fist. Hundreds of workers marched on Whitehall, brandishing the demand that there must be no more shipyard closures on the Clyde. One of their leaders, communist shop steward Jimmy Reid.
It can't be justified economically, but even more disastrously, it could never be justified with the social consequences of the action. And I'm telling you, we put it to Heath. How can a government in the 1970s try and take economic decisions in the abstract? It's pre-Keynes, as I said to your colleagues there, it's prehistoric. And it belongs to the 19th century, and I think, despite their suavity, or how suave and well-mannered and well-modulated their voice, I think we're dealing with a bunch of political cavemen.
The reaction had already been gaining impetus, like a runaway powder wagon, and now it exploded. The convener of the UCS Coordinating Committee of Shop Stewards, another communist, Jimmy Early.
We put the points for the retention of shipbuilding and total in the upper reaches of the Clyde, and the case against the disastrous decision of the government, which will mean, if we allow it, and we have no intention to allow it, will be contraction, unemployment and serious social implications. We also made the point to the Prime Minister. We were not interested in attacking his government. We were not down to make political capital, but rather to appeal, because of the social implications, to be statesmanlike and think what it would mean to the economy of Scotland. We appealed, but quite frankly, we got nowhere, and we're going to fight.
And they were convinced their wrath was righteous. The men believed that UCS had been getting better results. Facts in their case. Even allowing for Yarrow's opting out, the UCS labour force had been reduced by 25%. Productivity in the past year had risen by 87%. Although you can't properly judge output in any one calendar year, here's the form. Ships delivered in 1968, 3. In 1969, 7. In 1970, 12. And this year looked like becoming the most productive of all. Before liquidation, UCS had been projecting 15 ships for delivery. One of the workers who, from their own experience and involvement, couldn't gauge how they had become bankrupt, Willie Clydeside.
It was a case, I admit, in the past where you had maybe 3 men doing a job where one man could do it. But in the UCS, over the last 18 months, we've had agreements here, flexibility agreements, that do away with this sort of thing. I'm a welder, for instance, and we always, in the past, historically, we wouldn't allow anyone to touch your welding gear. But this isn't the case now. When Douglas came in, Douglas is a shipbuilding man, you know, and whether it's bias in our part that we say, well, here is a shipbuilding man, it's proved himself at Austin Pickingills, you know, that we've backed him up since then, and he's proved it with his production figures. And we believe it's a bloody liberty, actually, that when we're coming to near the part where we could be viable, that we should get closed down.
All right, the complex mess of wage scales had been simplified. The poor rate of steel handling had shot up at last. What else? Tom Field, Boilermaker.
When one thinks of the disputes at Barra, Birkenhead, Newcastle, and so on, one realises that the employers there would have given the right hand to have the labour relations which exist in the UCS. One could say, over 3 years, far better labour relations with Upper Clyde shipbuilders than any other shipbuilding industry in Great Britain.
There were impressions and there were inventories. There was Clydeside and there was Whitehall, 2 ends of a grim game of truth and consequences. Had the men been misled in their optimism about the future of UCS? At the Department of Trade and Industry, the Minister for Industry, Sir John Eden.
Certainly there have been considerable improvements, but the improvements haven't been enough to save the company from going bankrupt. That is the harsh reality of the situation. I would hope that the sort of measure of changed attitudes which one had seen developing there will be able to be carried forward into whatever new situation arises.
It would seem that this will require a further injection of state capital. Now, with all of these mounting costs and killing off UCS, have the government, in fact, worked out the total cost of it all and set that against the possibility of simply letting UCS go on in its own terms with the 5 or 6 million they asked for?
It isn't the total cost that really is the deciding factor in a case like this. I think what we've all of us got to take on board is that it is absolutely wrong for this government, for any government of this country, to go on pouring public money to back up proposals which are basically unsound, which are basically unviable.
Back on Clydeside, it was difficult to escape the burning suspicion of the men about the government's intentions. An electrician at Fairfield's Sam Gilmore.
The Tories were determined to shut us down. Well, we know that now. We're convinced of that now. But we are not accepting any more human sacrifices. And this is what has happened in the past. For to get credit, to get assistance, we had to give a human sacrifice, so many jobs. And then we patted each other and said, well, that's tough. Somebody's got to go. Well, that time's finished, because where they go now, they go nowhere. And if a good ship Clyde's going down, it'll be going down with all hands on board. All hands. You know, we're not saying that the world owes us a living, but it certainly owes us the right to earn a living.
Accusations about a long-standing Conservative plan to dispose of UCS stemmed mainly from publication in June of this year and May last year from Mr. Nicholas Ridley's alleged memorandum to the Shadow Cabinet. Mr. Ridley at that time, about 18 months before liquidation, was a Conservative front-bench spokesman on shipbuilding, but now he was Under-Secretary in the Department of Trade and Industry. He was alleged to have stated in it that a Conservative government should put no more public money into UCS, that Yarrows should be allowed to leave the consortium if they wanted, and that a government butcher should sell cheaply to the Scott Lithgow Group on the lower reaches of the Clyde and to others the assets of UCS. Do Mr. Ridley's views influence government thinking on shipbuilding?
Well, that memorandum I never even knew about. Nor did, well, I don't think any of us did, quite honestly. It certainly, let me make it absolutely clear, it had nothing whatsoever to do with this UCS situation. Nothing at all. The last thing we wanted to have happen was that UCS collapsed, that it went into liquidation, that it became bankrupt. This isn't something that has been part of government policy. This isn't an objective. We came into this government not to wreck people's employment prospects, but to secure viable projects for them, to give them long-term employment prospects in the future.
It's a matter of perspectives. If you try to see it from the point of view of Sam Gilmore and his family and others, that you've given nearly all that was asked and still been condemned, then the question, why, takes on a more bitter ring.
The lads were having a go because this was the first time that they felt that there was going to be any payout at the end of the day. Where incentive schemes, you know, that used to be a dirty word. Well, it might be a dirty word again, because the basic betrayal of trust, you know, that has happened here, that we've accepted that every modern technique. Maybe this is where we fell down. Maybe we should have been Luddites.
Bitterness of that kind hasn't been too difficult to find throughout Scotland recently. The promised improvements, the new sound economic base, replacing the old heavy industries with new growth industries. Politicians of successive governments preaching the gospel of regional development. And then 140,000 people saying, how the hell do you get 140,000 unemployed? Follow Willie Clydesdale. Take any road in Scotland. There is usually shortbread box scenery, but still food for thought.
Scotland is scenically, you know, for scenery and things like that, it's a lovely country. There's no two ways about it. But unfortunately, people don't live in scenery, you know. My name's Clydesdale, and Clydesdale is the name of a great stallion, you know. But unfortunately, the stallions, I can't live in grass. And any government that doesn't take into their consideration the social consequences of their action, then to my mind, it's time they gave it up.
I hope nobody believes that the government doesn't care. I got this impression slightly when I was up in Glasgow recently. We do care deeply about these things. We care about them in individual terms, and whether it's an older couple or a younger married couple starting out on life who suddenly find the whole of their future prospects are turned upside down by this situation, it matters to us very deeply indeed. And it is this that we are out to try and put right, but not for short-term purposes, in order to get the thing right basically, structurally, long-term. That's what we're working for.
Long-term can sound like a prison term if you're in the present position and frame of mind of Tommy Lumsden, aged 19, in the final year of an apprenticeship, worried about completing it.
As I'm married with a kid, it's bad. It's bad all over. When I talk to my friends, most of them want to get out of the country. Nothing for them to do, like work-wise, in Clydeside or Glasgow. I could go on a dole, as I said, and watch my child, but I don't want to do that. I want to work. I want to work for a living.
Listen, if you had sprung from some of the places, some of the families from which these men came, then you, like them, would have the fear of unemployment programmed in your very genetic material. This is Clydeside. Memories are long and tempers are short.
There'll be a run down in Singers. There'll be a run down in Brockhouse. There'll be a run down in Tullises. No, we've got the whole lot. We've got the whole lot. So what do we do? What do we do?
If you're in a job, you wait to start the afternoon shift. If you're among the 1 in 10 who are out of work in Clydebank, you just walk around, and outside the Kilbowie Road Employment Exchange, you catch the doleful drift.
I've just come back up from Manchester after 6 months working there, going from job to job because I've been, paid off. I was working in the British Steel Corporation in Openshaw. They're shutting it down in August, and I was unfortunate. I was only in for 6 weeks, so I got made redundant. Since then, they've said they're going to shut down the Earlham works. But there I went to another firm in Manchester. That firm was doing work for the Ministry of Defence. That order came to an end, and I get paid off. So I've been unemployed, come up here, and now I'm finding that, the only alternative to get employment is to get into the armed forces and get into the RAF on Monday.
It's a terrible situation. You either immigrate or else you're forced into the military service. Military service, this is the thing, What kind of government policy is this, when you're forced into military service?
It should be government policy to have the industry in Clydebank, where the people need it. Instead of, we don't want an American system where American populace shifts from area to area. But Clydebank people have got their roots in Clydebank. They want to stay in Clydebank.
The changing of sunlight to moonlight, reflections of my life. Oh, how they fill my eyes.
One of the reflections of life in Scotland traditionally is that many young people across the years have emigrated. Emigration, like Sartre's view of hell, is other people. But they are usually young people. No point in emigrating if you're old.
All my sorrow said tomorrow, take me back to your hometown. All my crying, none of my
Old slum deformities, new dull uniformities. Not as shabby as some towns of industrial Scotland, but this Clydebank. Why should anybody want to stay here if they can get work elsewhere?
Clydebank's all right. If you go around Clydebank and look at it right, it's got community centres, it's got dance halls, it's got clubs, cinemas. Clydebank is progressing, let me tell you. You can see the old buildings come down, new buildings coming up, new schools getting built. If the industry in Clydebank stays, Clydebank could have a prosperous future. I wouldn't leave my wife or my child to go away and work any other place.
Now, Clydebank's population is just over 50,000, and there is this feeling of identification. You're a Bankie. If you live in the town, you're a Bankie.
Jimmy Reid wasn't born a Bankie. It's his hometown by adoption. He's not only one of the workers' leaders, but also a town councillor.
If you lived in some suburbia, I'm quite certain you might have better housing conditions, but you won't have better neighbours than I've got. Let me put it that way.
anybody in trouble. I think this is a characteristic of working class communities. Everyone rallies around to help. And I think that a feeling of belonging and a feeling of democracy is more important than bureaucracy that you get from over-centralisation. No, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a beautiful place to live. And I don't think economists should determine where we live. There's a terrible philosophy flying about the now that men and families and communities should follow work and that work shouldn't be brought to communities. I mean, if you're talking about work, what are you talking about there? You're talking about machinery, you're talking about factories. These are inanimate objects, much more important than human beings.
What were they talking about in the Boilermakers Club 2 weeks after the initial shock? An easing of fears, even a word of optimism. There had been so much sympathetic reaction. These shipyards, they were landmarks. They couldn't possibly be shut down. And the band played, well, nostalgic songs. The people mostly middle-aged, couthy, with regular habits and regular hire purchase payments, and the stock saying, "We never died a winter yet." Anyway, it was now the end of June. The Clydebank Fair was coming up. Everybody goes on holiday then.
Most of our package tour people are again going to Spain and Mallorca, and having paid the holidays a month beforehand and having continuity of employment for the next 6 weeks, no one seems to be concerned about cancelling at all. They're all taking their holidays and worrying afterwards.
Without money.
The worries of the liquidator, Mr. Robert Courtney Smith, were just beginning. And so were the studies being made by the government's 4 experts, consultations, private discussions, boardroom business. But at another level, a different form of deliberation. The shop stewards had cancelled their summer holidays. They were preparing, if necessary, to take over the shipyards themselves. 2 men, dissimilar personalities, had firmly stamped their place in the leadership. Jimmy Airlie did not have the same oratorical bravura as Jimmy Reid, who worked with a more urbane and broader philosophical approach. Airlie, a former military policeman turned trade union centurion, was the blunt, hard-headed operator, more basso, less profundo than Reid. He's also a big chuckler, and in Glasgow terms, a useful pattern merchant.
I can't go any further in a bailhouse and pub. And if the situation deteriorates any worse, where am I going to go? It's the bare feet and the kilty peen, right?
But he knew that what they were tackling was a deadly serious business. Takeover of the shipyards could be fraught with possible legal hazards, some of which they couldn't even foresee.
It will be an occupation and an attempt to run the yards. This has never been done in Britain before. We will have problems, but we'll meet these problems as they arise. We have not a blueprint. Naturally, in this type of society, you don't have blueprints for occupying capitalist premises.
In this kind of perplexed truce, there was little choice but to knock on with the normal. They launched one of the new Clydeside ships, with no champagne, no hullabaloo of bunting. Just quiet congratulations all round. On Friday, July 2nd, Clydebank went on holiday, many people taking with them the consoling view that the government's 4 experts in working out the reorganisation of UCS would see sense and reprieve John Brown's. And you could almost feel the silence steal in with uneasiness. Strange places, shipyards, strange disordered shapes, yet out of them an end product of vast and marvellous symmetry. July 29th, after the Clydebank holidays had ended and before expected, the verdict came. In the House of Commons, Mr. John Davis, Minister of Trade and Industry, delivered it. Outside the yard gates at Clydebank, the people waited for the news. The shop stewards broke it to them. It had come from London by telephone. The judgment of the 4 experts was unequivocal and was accepted by the government. The Clydebank yard and the Scotstoun yard were to be shut. Work was to be concentrated in the Govan shipyard and the steel prefabrication sheds nearby. 2,500 would be the labour force, which was a significant reduction even there. It followed, therefore, that nearly 6,000 would become redundant. The men were violently angry. Experts, they said, butchers more like.
How do you think the men will take this news?
Take it, and they will be demanding action from MPs of the Labour movement in Scotland who have been sitting, sleeping and dormant during this period.
As a minister, I have tended in many matters to lean to the right, but I'm quite sure that all sections of this community, irrespective of political or religious background, will be unified in saying that the government have made a tremendous error.
In a perverted fashion, the Tories have done us a good turn because they've made everybody know that we're all in a one boat.
I think, as it's been said before, we don't only build ships, we build men at Clydebank. And this government has taken something on now, I'm quite sure, that will reverberate round this country.
And the reverberations were like the thunder of drag chains down the slip as they hit back next day with the work-in, initially at John Brown's Clydebank. They were launching something new, something destined to make big waves.
The joint shop stewards are utterly unanimous. We're going to fight this. And we're going to fight it with a determination that Britain hasn't seen from any section of the working class this century, let alone since 1945, and we'll do it. The press are here, and we want to tell them that we were serious, we weren't bluffing, and we've taken the first step today. The shop stewards representing the workers are in control of this yard. Nobody and nothing will come in, and nothing will go out without our permission. The security officers have been told that and they accept it. The gate man is there. We'll take the decisions with your endorsement that determines what comes in or out this yard. And we're not strikers. We're responsible people, and we'll conduct ourselves with the dignity and discipline that we have all the time expressed over the last few weeks. And there will be no hooliganism. There will be no vandalism. There will be no bevying. Because the world is watching us, and it's our responsibility to conduct ourselves responsibly and with dignity and with maturity.
And there will be no police hammering at the gates, and there will be no militia, no action by the courts, certainly not right away. Workers at Scotstoun and at Govan and Linthouse joined the work-in as soon as they returned from holiday a week later.
And accept this recommendation. Down there.
It was, you see, a peculiar inside-out siege. The men had occupied the shipyards and were continuing at work, but the liquidator wanted them at work, at least for some time, because there were still ships to be built or completed. For the men, occupation was surer than the prospects of a few months' work, dribbling on to extinction.
Because all our experience in the Clydeside has been, once you're out of place and in the doll queue, once the padlocks are on the door, you're finished, and the place is finished.
The work-in was at the core of a campaign to block closure and give the government time to change its mind. And so there were 8,000 inside the fortress, waiting on the forces outside to surrender. A peculiar inside-out kind of siege. Was the government willing to change its mind? August 3rd, Mr. John Davis, on a visit to Glasgow, said they had an open mind about possible alternative solutions. He had none of his own to offer, but would listen. August 4th, Mr. Harold Wilson came to Clydeside, offering his alternative solutions, praising the workers for their action, but making it clear that he could not support it if it went as far as breaking the law. Inside the yards, they went on building ships anyway. That was the distinctive ritual of their protest.
Now, usually when a liquidator comes in, everyone gets demoralised and production slumps. That did not happen because demoralisation springs from a sense of defeat, and there is no sense of defeat. Since the government announcement just over a week ago, we've got the quite unique phenomenon where the one yard that's been working owing to the variance in the holidays at Clydebank, steel production's gone up. I mean, it's unprecedented. I'm sure it's unique, not only in this country but throughout the world, and it's a testimony to the men.
Shop stewards met in the yards each morning, and later the coordinating committee from all of them met at Clydebank to hear reports on how production was proceeding inside and how the campaign was being advanced outside. As part of that campaign, the committee would hold a press conference, usually each working day. The liquidator was continuing to pay for supplies to get ships finished, and with money from the government, he paid the weekly wage bills too. But the first of the redundancies would soon be issued by him. And with all their efforts, some of the shop stewards were feeling the strain. Willie Clydeside.
I find my duties have changed very much. Previously, my job as a shop steward was more or less as an intermediary between the men and management. Now I'm playing a role with management.
And how strong would the support of management and staff remain? Because some of them would be the first to be put out of work.
We intend to have full support for them in this fight, which is our fight.
Basically, they were convinced they were all in the same boat, and the managers weren't being forced to walk the plank.
We're still seeing the jobs getting done. The men are still working away. We have not stopped one thing in this yard. We are still carrying out our jobs, as we usually do. And no complaints from nobody.
Kevin, one to you.
Excepting a few who opted out, everybody was paying a levy of 50 pence a week to a fighting fund. Money was also flooding in from an assortment of sympathisers.
This is one from the home counties, Derry's. Dear brothers, we'd like you to accept this contribution of £7. Very good. Very nice.
Hundreds from trade union branches, 1,000 from a woman doctor in Yorkshire, 1,000 plus a bunch of roses, red of course, from John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
Well, this one's from the Royal Court Theatre. It is excellent, £50.
And a book token from a pensioner and a tenner with the message, "Power to the People," from a television playwright. The money? It was to pay enough to alleviate hardship among those who were declared redundant but continued at work in defiance. Their national insurance cards would be stamped self-employed. The redundancy money? Nobody was quite sure when and how that might be paid. But they weren't arguing. They were saying, "We are staying, we are working."
In het bijzonder begroet ik vanavond onze collega's van de Schotse scheepswerven, de Upper Clydeside Shipbuilders, Shop Steward van de vakbeweging Willie Clydeside en Robert McCann. En wil hun vragen...
Shop stewards had been on the move to various parts of Britain to foster support. Willie Clydesdale went to Amsterdam at the invitation of Dutch shipyard workers who subscribed £1,700.
A labour force that had been reduced by 25%. In anyone's language, this would be considered a notable achievement.
In de 18 maanden die wij met Ken Douglas werkten, hij was de nieuwe directeur-manager die door wetsvloed benoemd was.
Suddenly, it was August for the people. There were pledges of cooperation from many trade unions. Lorry drivers said they would continue to bring in supplies, even if the liquidator tried to stop them. And tugboat crews said they would refuse to tow away completed ships if the shop stewards in the yards said no. And on August 18th, they were out on the streets, 50,000 or more, marching to Glasgow Green in the biggest demonstration the city had seen since the war, watched and applauded by thousands more. And it went on, the peculiar euphoria of protest. The next day, the first redundancies were published.
When I arrived back on the Saturday, I had a Dear John from the liquidator telling me that he felt my services were no longer required. So on the surface, as far as the liquidator and Mr. Heath is concerned, I am redundant. But as far as I'm concerned, as far as the workers in the yard, I'm still pursuing my duties as a shop steward and a worker. It's purely academic. We'll either all be redundant or we'll all be re-engaged.
And it went on, with some unions quickly agreeing to pay dispute benefit to help their redundant members, while others dragged their feet. And individuals as well as institutions having to reassess the strength of their attitudes and loyalties.
Well, I support the working. I mean, I've done a grand job there, but I can see no future in here from me and my wife. And I'm making plans to immigrate to America. This is my own personal feelings. Because this place has no future, I don't think, anyway.
And it went on, a challenge to the right, to the government's economic policies, and by its nature, also a challenge to the left, its solidarity and self-sacrifice.
For too long, people have accepted that trade unions have been a sort of friendly society. You pay your dues, you get certain benefits, namely death benefit, you know, the one that nobody ever wants to get. But we've proved that the British people have a conscience, then that no government, no trade union leaders, or nobody in any position of authority can afford to ignore the wishes of the people. And the support we have had here, and a spontaneous support. I mean, we never, at least I personally, never expected such an upsurge support from people. And I think that there's a lesson here for everybody, that the movement will move.
And it went on. The fighting fund, estimated at £50,000, was paying out £10,000 a week to the hundreds declared redundant but still working. How long could the working endure?
And I think that we who collected the subscriptions every Friday evening and the Monday, and knowing the problems that the pay packets have been dropping, we know that the determination is there.
If we lose this, then we lose everything, because we're in the dough. We can't afford to lose this fight.
If we fail, and it will be a terrible thing if we fail, that's my opinion, it'll be a terrible thing for Scotland. But if we fail, then there is no shame in that failure, because at least we fought. We are doing what we think we have to do as men. It's as simple as that. Now, if that brings us into conflict with people, asserting our rights in this sense, then I think there's something wrong with the morality and the ethics of the institutions that run this country.
The Mary and the Lizzie, they were made right here, but you'll never see the likes of them, I fear. They were the finest ever sailed the sea. They were built by the hands of men like me. Thank you, Dad, for all your skill. But the Clyde is a river that'll no stand still.